Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitical risk and insurance markets meet. I'm your host, David Benyon, and I'm joined by Matthew Brooke, Senior War and Terrorism Underwriter at Markel International. And our theme for this episode is underwriting political violence within a dynamic risk environment, with social unrest as perhaps the top challenge, but war risk threats also looming large and getting closer to home. We start with an introduction to Matthew's role, background, and the PV portfolio at Markel. And then we get into the international underwriting approach at Markel International, demand signals and portfolio management across a challenging mix of PV perils, across war, civil unrest or SRCC, and sabotage and terrorism. And lastly, the conversation moves to the shifting geopolitical risk environment itself, so perceptions among buyers, and discussing the stickiness of PV demand for some key perils and key countries. Okay, that's plenty for me. Let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast. Nice to speak to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much for having me on it.
To start with, could you introduce your role at Markel International and outline how the organisation approaches war, terrorism, PV underwriting globally?
Sure. So my name is Matthew Brooke. I am a senior underwriter on the war terrorism team at Markel. I sit in the London office, and we have a global portfolio of sabotage, terrorism, strikes, riots, civil commotion, and war. And we write that from a number of locations, from London to Dubai, India, Singapore, and also in the US.
For the portfolio's composition, I'm always struck by exactly that, the mix. It interests me because the risks are quite different between traditional terrorism risk, traditional war risk, and then you've got sabotage, SRCC in the middle. Yeah, how do you balance that? What's the composition like?
The composition is quite balanced between the three kind of main bulk blocks of perils. So the three groups would be sabotage and terrorism, strikes, riots, civil commotion, and then you've got your warlike perils, which is everything up to war in cross-border war, cross-state war.
So literally like a sort of about a third for each.
Give or take. It does vary from year to year, but obviously it depends on what risks are coming through, what our renewal portfolio looks like, and we try and balance that with being adaptive to the risk environment.
So your career so far, you worked across marine and political risk and PV, so just want to walk us through that journey and how you would say that varied background has shaped how you approach underwriting today.
Sure. So I've been in the insurance industry in London for 12 years now. It was November 2013 I joined WRB as my first role in insurance as an ops assistant, and I moved quite swiftly into the marine team, and they underwrote hull, war, liability, cargo. That portfolio closed down, and I then moved into the political violence and political risk team. So had a pretty holistic view on risk and have managed to use that to develop my underwriting and bring that into Markel as well for the last 4 years.
Well, congratulations on the recent promotion. So senior underwriter now.
Yep. It's there. That happened back in March, I think it was, or was it April? I've lost track.
Now you're working at that senior underwriting level. What kind of characteristics tend to make a risk interesting or tricky enough that it comes to you?
My role as a senior underwriter has moved to more leadership and portfolio management than it is day-to-day underwriting. I report into our head of terrorism in London, Chloe Gorge, and I, along with the other senior underwriter, do provide that support in terms of portfolio management. But what's important is that we, through leadership in the team, we allow and empower our underwriters to make decisions. So for a complex risk, there's no reason why any underwriter in the team can't pick that up. There might be an occasion where a second pair of eyes is a good option. To allow that knowledge sharing to exist on an area where an underwriter might not have the most experience within the team. It's all about that risk sharing and knowledge sharing, whether it's across the globe or within team. The key word that we use is collaboration, and we use that across our offices globally. So I could have an inquiry that comes from an underwriter in Singapore or Dubai or the US. But if it's in the team in London, we empower our underwriters to make those informed decisions by us helping to develop their skills as senior underwriters, as those who've got more experience in the field, but there's no risk that any underwriter can't pick up. So there's no specific criteria that would mean that I have to have a look at a risk per se. It's more a second pair of eyes if someone has a thought about a risk and would rather sense check what they're looking at, because I might have more experience in that territory or with that peril or with that wording than them.
When you think about portfolio management across the perils, how do you balance those aggregates, things like country caps and line sizes, to keep exposure coherent across geographies as well?
It's a really interesting point because the class of business that we sit in is relatively dynamic. If you think about strikes, rights, civil commotion perils, they are reactive. Clients are reactive in terms of their purchasing and inquiries. And we react and have to react to elections and protests. So within our portfolio, we use country scores, we use, like you've mentioned, aggregates, country caps, line sizes, appetite matrix, country-specific appetite matrices to allow us to be flexible and also respond quickly to any emerging risks and issues that we see. Allows us to be really dynamic. If you think about the war that's happening in Europe at the moment, there have been more requests for coverage in Ukraine. There have been more requests, especially of late, for risks in Poland and other bordering territories with Ukraine, which are as a result of drones and missiles that are not necessarily targeting those countries, but have crossed borders, intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah, we've seen debris landing in parts of Poland and sort of sabotage attacks as well, haven't we? In I think a Polish shopping centre, and it was at a train line that got hit, although attribution obviously is a bit trickier than that, but heavily suspected it's Russian sabotage, yeah. So let's talk about SRCC for a moment, because, you know, there's a meaningful volume of SRCC activity. We've seen it in many cities across the globe. How significant is SRCC within the book? I think you already said it's about a third, roughly speaking, but how does its increasing frequency profile affect how you think about exposure?
You're right in saying that SRCC's increasing frequency is there. It is growing. It is a dynamic risk that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and it is part of our portfolio. I do think that the risk profile of war and terrorism teams' portfolio has not necessarily shifted in terms of exposure, but the losses that you might expect to see are more focused on SRCC. There are definitely more SRCC risks coming into the market as clients see that risk being more prominent to their assets than potentially traditional terrorism and even war. But of course, that varies territory to territory, continent to continent. You would probably see more of an SRCC risk in South America and parts of Africa.
Look at the US. We have seen SRCC events taking place, but doesn't mean necessarily that everyone buys the coverage.
No, and I think that's very much a feature of our market, which is that clients tend to be reactive to the events that have happened around them. You might have a little bit more visibility on what perils might be affecting your business with elections. You've got the Chile elections. Global elections is where we can try and monitor and understand where that risk might evolve into.
Yeah, it's a date in the diary, isn't it, rather than just something completely out of the blue.
Exactly.
All the kind of classic terrorism tools, quite good, like bomb blast models and stuff, but it doesn't seem to me like it's moved on to cope with the current generation of perils that we're having to insure here within the book. Some of it, sure, you still got physical terrorism explosion risk, right? But it doesn't say much about SRCC. So how well does the existing modelling cope with today's mix of perils, you know, especially SRCC? Where do you feel the market's analytical limits are being tested?
SRCC is a really difficult peril to model, especially an in-event scenario. It is so dynamic and so reactive when you think about social media and how that can really spread and change how a protest evolves and the damage it can cause. AI can be used to model somewhat, and it's definitely a tool which Markel is trying to embed into its underwriting to improve the process that we all go through as underwriters. I think social media obviously plays a huge part in how those protests are organised and yeah.
Would you use Twitter, or X as it's now known? And just sometimes just using X can itself feel risky these days.
But it's a data source, and we are a data-driven team, and we underwrite using data, not hearsay. So we need to see concrete data and concrete analytics to be able to confidently underwrite. So where that information is collated from, it will be all sources that we could get our hands on and sense checked and tested before we put that into our underwriting decisions.
What would you like to see more of? If you could take your pick of the tools that exist, or maybe some that don't, for the challenges that you faced, what would you love to see more of in terms of useful tools that would help you as an underwriter?
I've seen a couple of clients in the past use CFD models to try and work out blast zones and how a blast affects an open area versus...
That's fluid dynamics, right?
Yeah, computer fluid dynamics. But trying to run that on every single risk is now impossible, and not something that we as underwriters have the expertise in, and would need a lot of development to allow that to feed into our portfolio. If it was available, then I think we'd probably use it a bit more.
So you've already referenced like a lot of buying is quite reactive. So yeah, we do see demand for these risks spiking after you get a major event, and then it can taper off. So just curious to get your view on recent demand trends and what you've seen recently in terms of buying behaviours, looking at maybe Eastern Europe with thinking about the Ukraine war threat across the border. Obviously, you've got EU countries that border on Ukraine, or perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, maybe one more, if there's not too many questions in one go, but what tends to make coverage sticky for buyers?
You're right in that demand is reactive, and we've spoken about that just now. Clients' interest will peak in the coverage that we offer just after an event, and that will generally taper off once incidents die down, or once civil unrest dies down, or once a threat of war dies down. The war in Ukraine and it being in Eastern Europe has created a demand from countries like Poland, who are seeking more frequently coverage for war and not just sabotage and terrorism, because they want to make sure that they are covered for all eventualities. And we, as an underwriting team, as a business, want to make sure that we're offering the right perils and coverage to those clients. South Africa is a territory which we have exposure in, and saw a large increase in inquiries just following the 2021 protesting, which caused a large amount of damage for the market, a large number of losses for the market.
Is that tapered off? Has that gone away now?
That hasn't tapered off. The risk remains relatively static, I would say.
I think because they're in uncharted territory there, aren't they? Because they had the elections a year ago, give or take.
May 2024.
But that created a coalition government, and that hadn't happened before. So no one knows what's going to happen next. So kind of that means there could be the threat of that government not lasting a full term, and you could have another election, and their political environment just isn't used to power sharing in that way. So maybe that's part of the reason why they're still buying, they're still concerned.
I think the important point here is that we as Markel offer a product and are working with our clients to make sure that the coverage is right, regardless of the political situation. Of course, that will impact how we feel about the risk and our analysis of the risk. Having contact with local brokers and local providers and understanding that risk on the ground is incredibly important to what we do. So having conversations not just with large corporations who provide services, but also individuals who operate, work, live in that territory is also important to understand the risk environment. When the client's perception of ongoing risk is there, that coverage remains sticky.
Yeah, well, of course, in some markets you have mandatory coverage, and they're all different. I think South Africa's a bit of a special case, isn't it? Because they have SASRIA.
South Africa has SASRIA. SASRIA provides a certain level of coverage, which we as underwriters will top up to the desired level of coverage that the client feels they need. Clients also think about their loss history that they've had, and clients also think about whether or not they've had losses. If they've had losses and see the benefit of the coverage, then they will likely continue to buy.
Let's talk about the geopolitical environment. I think it's fair to say that there's been a shift in public awareness about, in Europe, the conflict in Ukraine. Is that changing the conversations that you're having with clients? I suppose every client, we're all members of the public,
about war risk? Is PV insurance more widely seen as more relevant now than it was?
I think it's always been an important coverage that clients can purchase. The war in Ukraine feels and is for a lot of clients much closer to home, and they see an increased risk from that. So those conversations are more meaningful for those clients when they understand the coverage that we can offer. For us as underwriters, I wouldn't say that necessarily changes our appetite or our approach to the risk at all. It's the clients who feel that their risk is becoming closer to home, not us as underwriters sitting in London. We operate across continents in terms of teams. We will always review a risk on its own merits so that we can give the client the best coverage using all the data at our disposal. It is our business. Sure, you could say that the war in Ukraine is closer to home than the DRC. Geographically, it is. But again, our underwriting approach remains fair and consistent and measured to make sure we're offering the right coverage to the right clients.
We're seeing renewed focus on national defence across Europe. You see this in the Nordics. They've always been quite good at this, like whole societal defence type concept. But we're returning to it in the UK, I think, after a holiday from history. But I think partly due to the noises we're seeing out of Washington, DC these days, that Europe is sort of feeling a little bit more it has to have this national defence focus. I'm just curious how you think that those political dynamics, including the uncertainty about the Americans, influences the risk environment, the PV risk environment, and some of the conversations that you have as a result of that.
I think it links back quite nicely with the increasing inquiries that we see and risk becoming closer to home. Politics will always influence our class of business, and there's no getting away from that. You see protests erupting globally from elections, and that's not going to change, but that's where we offer coverage, and that's where we maintain a consistent underwriting approach across geographies to make sure that we're looking at risks under portfolio on a holistic view, as opposed to focusing on one country's political dynamics and how that influences the rest of the world. Looking at how the US policy and how the US influences Europe, of course it's relevant to underwriters to a certain degree, but when you look at a risk itself, you're not going to change your underwriting approach and the data that you need to review that risk and how you perceive the risk necessarily. Because politics can be dynamic as protests, and can go up and down in terms of popularity and policy.
So finally, thinking about some of the geopolitical developments that we're seeing and loss activity when we've seen events transpire, are there some trends that have stood out to you, whether that's ongoing or just within the past year or so, that you think will shape underwriting decisions?
I think underwriters in the past have considered terrorism and war to be the main perils of concern. But nowadays, if you look at the events throughout this year alone, you've had protests in Mexico, protests in Madagascar, protests in Nepal, which have all been organised and focused around not necessarily one generation of people, but you could call them Gen Z. And it strikes me as a nod to people being more confident and comfortable voicing their concerns around government and policy.
Yeah, there have been some surveys, I think, that kind of reflect this. Gen Z being more comfortable with the idea of political violence, not just protest, but the idea that it's acceptable in some circumstances. It's possibly something we haven't seen in previous generations. And then it ties into all the other things, like the fact they've got social media. Once an event happens, it's more likely to happen somewhere else.
And not just in the same country. You find that movements can cross borders and continents with social media and people's access to information, whether it be correct or not, can influence protests.
Yeah, we've seen that in the UK.
Exactly.
I remember years ago reading that when the revolutions in 1848 happened in Europe, things happened at the speed, roughly speaking, that a horse could go from city to city in Europe. Like you could have something in Paris, and then a day or two later, you could have something in Germany. You know, the horse could travel the news with it. And then social media just means it's instantaneous.
Yeah.
So does all of this mean some reshaping of underwriting decisions?
For our approach going forward into 2026 and beyond, I think the most important thing to understand is that the risks that we insure is dynamic. So we have to be as dynamic as the risk itself. We wouldn't necessarily stop offering coverage because we want to be there for our clients and manage our portfolio and manage and help them with their risk management through a difficult time. We have scope, we have aggregates, which we of course underwrite to, and we can change those aggregates as needed within reason. It all plays into the portfolio that we write and strive to provide the right level of coverage for the clients that we have on our portfolio.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks very much for having me on the pod.
And that concludes this episode, but please don't worry, there'll be another one along soon. And I'd just like to thank my wonderful guest for this episode, Matthew Brooke, Senior War and Terrorism Underwriter at Markel International. So until next time, thanks for listening and please tune in again. I've been your host David Benyon, and production was by Peter McGill, and my cousin Lawrence Durkin made the music.